Here's the paradox that haunted Carl Jung for decades. The most conscious people often end up the most alone in love. Not because they can't love deeply, but because something fundamental shifts during what Jung called individuation. Today I'll reveal why those who wake up spiritually struggle to fall in love the way they once did, and what this means for finding real connection. Jung observed something disturbing in his clinical practice. Patients who had undergone deep psychological work, who had integrated their shadows and developed what he called differentiated perception, consistently reported the same strange problem. They could see through people with startling clarity. They noticed the masks everyone wore, the lies people told themselves, the unconscious tensions humming beneath every social interaction. This wasn't pathology. This was consciousness so advanced it had become socially dangerous. These individuals lived in a different reality from most people, and that perceptual gap made normal relationships nearly impossible. Jung wasn't treating a disorder. He was observing what happens when someone becomes too aware for ordinary social survival. The spiritually awake person sees the depression behind forced smiles. They sense desperation beneath confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. This ability creates profound isolation because they can no longer participate in the comfortable illusions that make conventional relationships function smoothly. Here's where Jung's insights become uncomfortable. Falling in love, in its conventional form, relies on a psychological mechanism that awakened individuals have dismantled. Jung called it projection of the anima or animus, the inner idealized image of the opposite sex that everyone carries in their unconscious. When someone falls in love at first sight, they're not seeing the actual person. They're seeing their own inner ideal projected onto another human being. The beloved becomes a container for fantasies, hopes, and unconscious contents that have nothing to do with who they actually are. This creates that intoxicating feeling of having found your soulmate, your missing half, your completion. But people who've undergone individuation have started integrating their own anima or animus. They've begun the process of becoming psychologically complete within themselves. They've reclaimed those projections and recognized them as parts of their own psyche that need internal development. The conflict becomes clear. When you've integrated your inner opposite, you can no longer fall in love the way unconscious people do. You see the other person as they actually are, not as a screen for your fantasies. You don't seek someone to complete you because you're already working toward being complete within yourself. This doesn't mean awakened people can't love. It means they can't fall into that unconscious, projection-driven infatuation that most people mistake for love. They see too clearly for that kind of romantic delusion. Every potential partner appears as a real human with flaws, limitations, and their own unconscious contents, rather than as an idealized savior or completion. Most people never integrate their anima or animus. They spend their entire lives projecting these inner figures onto partners, falling in love with their own unconscious contents reflected back at them. When the projection inevitably fades, they think they've fallen out of love. Really, they've just started seeing the actual person instead of their fantasy. The spiritually awake person has already done this work internally. They arrive at relationships with clear eyes and integrated psyches. This makes them terrible at the game of falling in love, because they refuse to play with projections anymore. Jung discovered something even more disturbing about why awakened people struggle in relationships. Their differentiated perception makes them mirrors for others' unacknowledged shadows. When you can see someone's unconscious contents clearly, your mere presence reflects back what they're trying to avoid about themselves. Most people are deeply unconscious of their own dark side. They've repressed their capacity for selfishness, cruelty, manipulation, and deception. These shadow contents don't disappear through repression. They accumulate in the unconscious, growing stronger in the darkness. The awakened person, with their clear perception, becomes a living mirror that reflects these denied aspects back to their owner. This creates an unbearable psychological pressure. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind faces two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Integration requires courage and consciousness that most people simply don't possess. It's far easier to attack the person reflecting your shadow than to acknowledge those dark aspects in yourself. This explains the scapegoat phenomenon Jung documented repeatedly. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in every group they enter, not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. In romantic relationships, this dynamic becomes devastating. The awakened person gently observes that their partner seems troubled, and the partner explodes at them for being negative. They express concern about obvious problems, and they're accused of manufacturing drama where none exists. Their clarity gets weaponized against them through projection. The awakened person becomes systematically targeted by a psychological force they can't rationally explain. They feel like they're going crazy because everyone insists they're the problem, when they're merely reflecting problems that were there all along. This pattern explains why conscious individuals often withdraw from conventional relationships entirely. The psychological cost of being everyone's shadow mirror becomes unbearable. Jung identified another barrier to love for awakened individuals: the persona, the social mask everyone wears in public. Most people are completely identified with their personas. The face they present to the world has become the only identity they recognize in themselves. The spiritually awake person sees through every persona instantly. They recognize the performance, the carefully constructed image, the gap between who someone pretends to be and who they actually are. This X-ray vision makes normal social bonding nearly impossible, because bonding typically happens through persona-to-persona interaction, when you can't see someone's mask anymore. When you only see the frightened ego beneath the performance, you become a destabilizing force in their life. Your authenticity threatens the shared illusion that keeps groups and relationships functioning. You become what Jung called an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. The awakened person threatens collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. Organizations, families, and societies function partly through unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Their presence exposes the personas everyone else is protecting. In romantic relationships, this creates a fundamental incompatibility. Most people fall in love with personas. They marry the performance, not the person. They commit to the image their partner projects, then feel betrayed when the real human emerges. The awakened person can't participate in this persona game anymore. They see the real human from the beginning, with all their wounds, defense mechanisms, and unconscious patterns. This makes them terrible romantic partners for unconscious people. They can't pretend not to see what they see. They can't play along with the performance. Their clarity feels like judgment, even when it's offered with compassion. The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. Jung documented 3 specific dangers that make superior perception potentially destructive in relationships. Understanding these dangers explains why awakened people often struggle to find sustainable love. First, psychological isolation. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering, Jung called this the problem of the superior function. The awakened person becomes existentially alone, living in a different reality from everyone around them. This isolation isn't just social, it's a fundamental disconnection from the collective unconscious participation that makes ordinary relating possible. Second, identity dissolution through what Jung termed participation mystique. Highly perceptive people absorb so much unconscious content from others that they lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become flooded with external psychological material until they can't distinguish between their own inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment. In relationships, this means losing yourself completely while trying to understand and accommodate your partner's unconscious processes. Third, the collective unconscious disruption we've already discussed. The awakened person becomes a threat to every system they enter. Their presence destabilizes the unspoken agreements that hold groups together. In romantic partnerships, this manifests as the constant feeling that you're too much, too intense, too aware for normal relating. These three dangers explain why individuation, while psychologically necessary, makes conventional love relationships extremely difficult. The awakened person must learn to maintain individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious contents, both their own and others. Most people never attempt this level of integration, which means most people remain accessible to conventional romantic relating. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. The goal isn't to find love the old way. The goal is to become a person capable of conscious love, which is something entirely different from unconscious falling. Jung's individuation process offers a path from destructive isolation to integrated connection. This isn't about suppressing your awareness or pretending not to see what you see. It's about developing the psychological strength to use your perception wisely while maintaining authentic relating. Phase 1 involves recognition and differentiation, establishing boundaries by distinguishing what belongs to you and what belongs to others. The awakened person must learn when they're absorbing someone else's psychological contents versus experiencing their own authentic feelings. This requires regular solitude, allowing absorbed material to settle so you can recognize your own psychological voice beneath the noise. Jung instructed his patients to spend time in complete isolation daily, not as withdrawal from life, but as necessary psychological hygiene. Without this discrimination between self and other, there can be no individual development. The awakened person must know where they end and others begin. Phase 2 requires shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you'll be by seeing these qualities in potential partners. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. When you accept your own shadow, you can witness someone else's darkness without needing to fix them or flee from them. You can love them anyway, because you've learned to love all of yourself. Phase 3 involves conscious participation, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. Jung called this serving as a bridge between conscious and unconscious. The awakened person learns to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily, like a psychological container, while maintaining awareness that these contents are not their own. This requires what Jung termed psychological containers, the capacity to be present with someone's pain, projection, or shadow without taking it personally or making it about you. In romantic relationships, this manifests as the ability to love someone deeply while letting them have their own psychological process. You can witness without rescuing. You can care without merging. You can love without losing yourself. Here's Jung's paradox. Individuation doesn't lead to isolation. It leads to what he called more intense and broader collective relationships. The awakened person, once they've completed sufficient integration, becomes capable of deeper connection than unconscious people can imagine, not through projection and fantasy, but through conscious recognition and authentic relating. The spiritually awake person must find what Jung called the few who understand, others capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. These connections are rare, but essential for psychological survival. Jung identified 3 types of essential relationships. First, fellow individuated persons, people who recognize each other instantly because they've both undergone the transformation. There's a quality of presence, an authenticity that cannot be fabricated. These connections often happen with startling speed and intensity because you recognize each other as members of what Jung termed the conscious minority. With fellow individuated people, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming or threatening them. They understand the burden of perception because they carry it themselves. They won't weaponize your clarity against you or make you feel like you're too much. These relationships are rare, but they're psychologically necessary. Second, those engaged in individuation. People actively doing their own inner work who understand the value of superior perception even if they don't possess it themselves. They might not see as clearly as you do, but they value consciousness and aren't threatened by it. Jung observed that people who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others. These individuals respond to perceptive observations with curiosity rather than defensiveness. They ask genuine questions instead of immediately protecting their personas. They can acknowledge their own contradictions and limitations without shame. They demonstrate what Jung called psychological mindedness, an interest in inner reality that makes them safe for awakened people to relate with. Third, natural containers. Mature individuals who, while not possessing differentiated perception themselves, have what Jung termed natural container function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. These are often people who've weathered significant life challenges and developed genuine wisdom through experience. Natural containers maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They show genuine curiosity about consciousness and growth. They don't need you to be less aware or less honest to feel comfortable with you. They appreciate your perception as valuable contribution rather than experiencing it as threat. Jung developed a recognition process for identifying these safe relationships. He taught his patients to begin with small, gentle observations and notice response patterns. When you share a perceptive insight, does the person become defensive or curious? Do they attack you for seeing clearly or thank you for the perspective? Their response reveals whether they can handle your level of consciousness. The gradual revelation protocol starts with minor observations, then progressively increases depth based on demonstrated capacity. You test the waters before diving deep. You assess whether someone becomes defensive or open when you share what you see. You frame insights as offerings rather than pronouncements, giving people the option to receive your perception without forcing it on them. Jung emphasized that the goal isn't finding people who accept everything you see. The goal is finding people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding rather than experiencing them as threats to their self-image. The journey of the spiritually awake person moves from curse to gift, from overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom. The problem was never the perception itself. The problem was the unconscious relationship to that perception. When you learn to integrate your awareness consciously, when you find the few who understand, when you develop the ability to love without projection, you discover something remarkable. Conscious love is infinitely more satisfying than unconscious falling ever was. It's based on seeing someone completely and choosing to love them anyway, not despite their flaws, but including their flaws as part of their complete humanity. The spiritually awake person doesn't need to suppress their consciousness to find love. They need to develop their consciousness fully enough to make room for conscious relating. This is the transformation Jung documented across decades of clinical work. From isolation to integration, from overwhelming awareness to wise engagement, from the curse of seeing too much to the gift of loving consciously. You weren't given differentiated perception to suffer alone. You were given it to pioneer a new way of relating that humanity desperately needs. Conscious love isn't easier than unconscious falling, but it's infinitely more real, more sustainable, and more aligned with who you actually are. If this resonates with your experience of struggling to find love after spiritual awakening, share in the comments which phase of integration you're currently in. Your journey connects with others walking this same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about consciousness that transcends collective limitations. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.